Your sister's baby will be perfect, Sarah. When's your turn? My mother's voice carried across the dining table with that particular tone I'd learned to recognize over 32 years. The one that managed to be both saccharine sweet and cutting at the same time. And I felt my hand tighten around my fork as I watched her beam at Jessica, my 29-year-old sister, who sat there glowing with that early pregnancy radiance everyone kept commenting on. Her hand resting protectively on a belly that barely showed any change yet. The question hung in the air like it had weight, like it demanded an answer. And I could feel my daughter Maya shifting beside me in her chair, this beautiful 4-year-old child with my dark curls and her father's green eyes, this little person who had transformed my entire world and who my mother had just looked right past while asking when I would finally do something worthwhile with my life. I took a breath, set down my fork with deliberate care, and felt something inside me that had been bending for years finally reach its breaking point. It already happened, I said, my voice steady and calm in a way that surprised even me. 4 years ago. The silence that followed was absolute. My father's knife stopped midway through his pot roast, frozen in the air like time had simply stopped moving forward. Jessica's eyes went wide, her mouth opening slightly in what might have been shock or confusion, or maybe both. My mother's carefully maintained expression of benevolent interest cracked, replaced by something between bewilderment and irritation, and I watched her gaze finally actually land on Maya, this child who had been sitting at their table for the past 45 minutes, eating green beans and quietly coloring on the kids' menu the restaurant had provided. "What are you talking about?" my mother asked, and I could hear the edge creeping into her voice, that defensive tone she got when reality didn't align with the narrative she'd constructed. I put my arm around Maya's shoulders, drew her closer to me, and felt her lean into my side with the easy trust that children have in their parents, the trust I'd spent 4 years earning and nurturing and protecting. "Mom, Dad, Jessica, this is Maya, your granddaughter, your niece." I watched the words land like physical objects, watched them try to reorganize their understanding of the situation, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when you've finally stopped running from a confrontation you've been avoiding for years. "I sent you a birth announcement. I called when I was pregnant. I've sent Christmas cards with photos for 4 years." Maya looked up at me with those perceptive eyes that missed nothing, and I could see her starting to understand that something significant was happening, even if she couldn't quite grasp what. My mother was shaking her head slowly, her perfectly styled hair not moving an inch, her lips pressed together in that way. That meant she was about to say something she thought was reasonable, but absolutely wasn't. I sat there at that table watching my mother's face reorganize itself into defensive confusion, and I felt the weight of every single year that had led to this moment, all 32 years of being the daughter who didn't quite measure up, the one whose accomplishments somehow never warranted the same celebration, the same attention, the same basic acknowledgement that Jessica received just for existing. I remembered being 7 years old and bringing home a report card with straight A's, clutching it in my small hands like it was made of gold, so proud and excited to show my parents, only to have my mother glance at it for maybe 3 seconds before saying, "That's nice, sweetie," and turning back to Jessica's art project, a finger painting that was objectively just blobs of primary colors, but somehow deserved to be framed and hung in the living room like it was destined for a museum. I remembered high school, making honor roll every single semester, getting into the National Honor Society, volunteering at the local hospital because I already knew I wanted to help people, wanted to do something meaningful with my life, and watching my parents attend every single one of Jessica's theater productions where she played background roles with no lines, cheering like she was on Broadway, while my academic awards ceremonies happened with them sitting in the audience checking their phones or not showing up at all because something had come up. The pattern was so consistent, so relentless, that I'd learned to stop expecting anything different. Learned to just put my head down and work toward my own goals because waiting for their approval was like waiting for rain in a desert. When I'd graduated from nursing school at 23, top of my class with job offers from 3 major hospitals, my mother's response had been to ask if I was sure I didn't want to do something more impressive, maybe become a doctor instead, while Jessica's art degree from a small liberal arts college where she'd maintained a solid C average was treated like she'd just been awarded a Nobel Prize. My father had called nursing a nice, stable job in the same tone someone might use to describe beige paint, functional but nothing to get excited about, and I'd stood there in my graduation gown, feeling the accomplishment drain right out of me, because somehow even 4 years of grueling work and clinical rotations and studying until my eyes burned, wasn't enough to warrant genuine pride from the 2 people whose opinion I'd spent my whole life trying to earn. So I'd moved to Seattle 6 years ago, put 3,000 miles between myself and the constant reminder that I would always be second place in my own family. And I'd built a life there, a real life with people who saw me and valued me and celebrated my successes because they were worth celebrating. I'd thought the distance would hurt less, that not being there to witness the endless Jessica Appreciation Society meetings would make it easier to bear, but instead it had just crystallized something I'd been avoiding my whole life, the clear, undeniable truth that my parents had a favorite child, and I would never be her. I remembered the exact moment I'd found out I was pregnant, sitting on the bathroom floor of my Seattle apartment at 6 in the morning with 3 positive pregnancy tests lined up on the counter like little plastic soldiers delivering the same message over and over. And I remembered the way my heart had felt too big for my chest, this overwhelming combination of terror and joy and something I couldn't quite name, but that felt like the future suddenly becoming real and tangible. David had been there, this man I'd been dating for 8 months, a pediatric nurse with kind eyes and steady hands who had held me while I cried and laughed at the same time, who had said, "We can do this," with such certainty that I'd almost believed him. We'd spent that whole day talking through options and possibilities and what we wanted, and by the end of it, I'd known with absolute clarity that I wanted this baby, wanted to become a mother, wanted to build something real and lasting with David. For 3 days, I'd carried the secret inside me like something precious and fragile, and I debated whether to tell my family, whether to reach out across those 3,000 miles and share this enormous, life-changing news, and some part of me that still held on to hope, that still believed maybe this time would be different, had convinced me to try. I'd called my mother on a Thursday evening, my hands shaking as I held the phone, and I told her straight out that I was pregnant, that David and I were together, and committed and excited despite it being unplanned, and I'd waited for something, anything that sounded like happiness or support or even just basic maternal concern. What I'd gotten instead was silence that stretched for at least 10 seconds, followed by my mother's voice saying, "Oh, Sarah," in this tone like I'd just told her I'd crashed her car, and then she'd asked if we were getting married, what people would think, whether I'd considered how this would look, and not once in that entire 15-minute conversation did she ask how I was feeling or if I was okay or if I needed anything. My father had gotten on the phone for maybe 90 seconds, said congratulations, I guess, like he was commenting on mildly interesting weather, and asked if I was still planning to come home for Christmas in 8 months, because Jessica had just gotten engaged and they were planning to announce it at the holiday gathering. I'd hung up that phone feeling like I'd been hollowed out, like something vital had been scooped out of my chest and replaced with cold air. And when David found me crying in our bedroom, I couldn't even explain it to him in a way that made sense because, how do you tell someone that your parents just couldn't muster up enthusiasm for your first child, your major life milestone, because it might overshadow your sister's engagement announcement? Jessica had called me 2 days later, and I'd congratulated her with genuine happiness because I'd never wished her ill, had never wanted her to have less. I'd just wanted to have something too. And she'd talked for 45 minutes about wedding plans and venues and dress shopping without once mentioning my pregnancy until the very end, when she'd said, "Mom told me your news, that's crazy," in this tone that made it sound like I'd made an impulsive mistake rather than created a human life. The pregnancy itself had been both harder and easier than I'd expected. Harder because I was navigating morning sickness and exhaustion, and the sheer physical transformation of my body while working 12-hour shifts at the hospital. Easier because the community I'd built in Seattle rallied around me in ways my actual family never had, with my coworkers throwing me a surprise baby shower at the hospital cafeteria, complete with pink decorations and more gifts than I knew what to do with. And my neighbor Elena, who had 3 kids of her own, spending hours teaching me about labor and delivery and showing me how to swaddle a baby with her practiced gentle hands. David had proposed to me when I was 6 months pregnant, not because he felt obligated, but because he wanted to, getting down on one knee in our tiny living room with a simple ring he'd saved for, and tears in his eyes as he said he'd never been more sure of anything in his life. And we'd gotten married at the courthouse 2 weeks later with Elena and my work friend Marcus as witnesses, and I'd worn a blue dress that accommodated my belly, and felt more joy in that 10-minute ceremony than I'd felt at any of the elaborate family events I'd attended growing up. Maya had been born on a rainy October morning, after 14 hours of labor, and the moment they'd placed her on my chest, this tiny, perfect human with David's nose and my dark hair, I'd understood for the first time what it meant to love something more than yourself, to feel your heart exist outside your body in the most vulnerable, terrifying, wonderful way possible. I'd sent my parents a photo 3 hours after she was born, a simple message that said, Maya Elizabeth, born October 15th, 7 pounds 4 ounces, everyone healthy, with a picture of her wrapped in the hospital blanket, and I'd waited for my phone to ring, convinced that surely this would be the thing that broke through their indifference, that meeting their first grandchild would matter enough to prompt an actual phone call or even a plan to visit. What I'd gotten instead was a text from my mother 6 hours later that said, "Congratulations, she's beautiful," followed immediately by, "Have you heard Jessica needs help picking bridesmaids' dresses for the wedding? She was hoping you could come home for that." No phone. Call. No questions about my health or whether the labor had been difficult or if I needed anything. No mention of wanting to meet their granddaughter or asking when they might be able to visit. My father had sent a separate text that just said, "Glad everyone is okay," and nothing else. And I'd sat there in my hospital bed holding my sleeping newborn daughter and made a decision that felt both liberating and devastatingly sad. The decision that if my family couldn't be bothered to show up for the most important moments of my life, I wasn't going to keep forcing myself into theirs. I stopped calling except for major holidays, stopped trying to share updates about Maya's milestones, stopped hoping that maybe this time they'd surprise me with actual interest. And for 4 years, I'd built this beautiful life in Seattle with David and Maya and our chosen family of friends who showed up for birthday parties and celebrated Maya's first steps and first words and treated her like she mattered because she did. The group text had come through on a Tuesday afternoon while I was finishing up my shift at the hospital, my phone buzzing in my scrub pocket with that particular insistent pattern that meant the family chat was active, and when I'd pulled it out during my break, I'd seen Jessica's message. "Mark and I have some exciting news. We're expecting baby arriving in December," followed immediately by a flood of responses from my mother and father and aunts and uncles, congratulations and celebration emojis and excited plans, and my mother's message that said, "I'm so happy I'm crying. My beautiful Jessica is going to be such a wonderful mother." The messages kept coming for hours, dozens of them, plans for baby showers and nursery themes, and my mother offering to fly out to help Jessica, offering to pay for a professional nursery designer, talking about how this baby would be so loved and so perfect, and I'd scrolled through them feeling this familiar hollow ache in my chest that I'd thought I'd moved past, but apparently hadn't. My phone had rung that evening, my mother's name lighting up the screen for the first time in probably 4 months, and when I'd answered, she'd launched immediately into talking about Jessica's pregnancy without even asking how I was, detailing all the plans she had for helping Jessica prepare, asking if I thought I could come home for the baby shower they were planning, saying how important it was for family to be together for these major moments. I'd made non-committal sounds and said I'd have to check my work schedule, and she'd gotten that edge in her voice that I knew meant guilt-tripping was coming, saying, "Sarah, your sister needs you. This is important. Surely you can make time for something this significant." Over the next 3 weeks, the pressure had intensified. More group texts about family gatherings I should attend, more calls from my mother discussing Jessica's registry and shower plans, and whether I was going to be there. And I'd declined most of the invitations, citing my nursing schedule, which was legitimately demanding, but also conveniently flexible enough that I could have made it work if I'd wanted to. The guilt tripping had escalated to my mother saying things like, "I don't understand why you're so distant. We're your family. Jessica really wants you there." And my father leaving awkward voicemails about how it would mean a lot if I visited. And finally, my mother had called with a direct invitation to a family dinner. "Just immediate family, nothing elaborate, please, Sarah. We never see you anymore." I'd felt something shift in me during that call, some combination of exhaustion and anger and a strange clarity, and I'd heard myself saying yes. I would come. I'd be there next Saturday, and my mother had sounded so surprised and pleased that it had almost made me sad. That night I'd talked to David about it, and he'd looked at me with concern and asked if I was sure, if I was really ready for whatever might happen, and I'd told him I was bringing Maya with me, that I was done hiding this huge part of my life, that if my family wanted to pretend she didn't exist, then they were going to have to do it to her face instead of through convenient silence. I'd made the decision fully and consciously. I was going to that dinner, and I was going to tell the truth, and whatever happened after that was on them. The week leading up to the dinner had been strange, like I was preparing for something between a family gathering and a battle, and David had noticed my tension immediately, finding me one evening sitting at our kitchen table going through my phone's photo album selecting pictures of Maya that I wanted to have ready to show, not that I expected my family to ask, but because I needed the evidence there, tangible proof of the 4 years they'd missed. David had sat down across from me and taken my hand, his touch warm and grounding as he'd asked if I was really sure about this, if I'd thought through what might happen when I told them. And I'd looked at him and said yes, I was sure, that I'd spent 4 years protecting myself by staying away, but that maybe it was time to stop hiding and start demanding the respect I deserved. He'd been quiet for a moment, and then said he supported me completely, but that he was worried about me getting hurt again, that these people had already shown me who they were, and I should believe them. And I'd appreciated his protectiveness even as I'd explained that this wasn't about expecting them to change, but about me refusing to carry their shame anymore, about me standing in my truth, regardless of how they reacted to it. The morning of the dinner, I'd woken up early with that tight feeling in my chest that came before difficult things, and I'd spent extra time getting Maya ready, choosing her favorite purple dress with the flowers on it and braiding her hair carefully. And she'd looked so beautiful and innocent that I'd felt this wave of protective anger at my parents for never bothering to know her. The drive to my parents' house was 2 hours through familiar roads I hadn't traveled in over a year, and Maya had been excited at first, chattering about meeting her grandparents and asking questions I'd been dreading, like why hadn't she met them before and did they know about her ballet class and would they have toys at their house? I'd answered as honestly as I could without burdening her with adult pain, saying that sometimes grown-ups don't stay as close as they should and that today was about trying to fix that, and she'd seemed satisfied with that explanation in the way only a 4-year-old could be, already moving on to singing songs from her favorite cartoon. As we'd gotten closer, I'd felt my resolve solidifying into something almost calm. This clarity that whatever happened in the next few hours, I was doing the right thing by refusing to hide anymore, by insisting that Maya be acknowledged and that my life be recognized as mattering. We'd pulled up to my parents' house at exactly 6 o'clock, the same brick colonial I'd grown up in, with the same perfect lawn and the same sense of everything looking right from the outside. And I'd sat in the car for a moment gathering myself before unbuckling Maya and taking her hand and walking up to that front door feeling more prepared for honesty than I'd ever felt before. My mother had opened the door with surprise registering on her face. When she'd seen Maya standing beside me, her expression shifting through confusion and something like annoyance before settling into forced pleasantness, as she'd said, "Sarah, you didn't mention you were bringing anyone," in that tone that suggested I'd committed some breach of etiquette, and I'd simply responded, "This is Maya," without explanation. Watching my mother's eyes flick over my daughter with polite disinterest before she'd ushered us inside, where my father stood in the hallway, offering an awkward wave, and Jessica was visible in the dining room with her husband Mark, her hand resting protectively on the small bump visible under her flowing dress. The house smelled like my mother's pot roast, the same meal she'd made for every family gathering for 30 years, and everything looked exactly as I remembered it. The formal dining table already set with the good china that only came out for important occasions, fresh flowers in the centerpiece, and I'd felt Maya's hand tighten in mine as we'd walked into the dining room where Jessica had looked up with surprise at seeing me with a child. My mother had made brief introductions, gesturing vaguely at Maya and saying, "Sarah brought a friend's daughter," in a way that made my jaw clench, but I'd decided to wait, to let this play out, to see exactly how deep their disinterest ran before I said anything. We'd all settled around the table with Jessica positioned at the head near my mother, Mark beside her looking friendly and open in a way that made me think I might like him under different circumstances, and my father had asked the perfunctory questions about my drive and whether traffic had been bad while my mother brought out serving dishes and launched immediately into discussing Jessica's pregnancy, asking about her doctor's appointments and whether they'd started thinking about names and how she was feeling with the morning sickness. Jessica had glowed under the attention, one hand on her belly, as she'd described every detail of her first trimester, and Mark had interjected supportive comments while my parents had hung on every word, my mother actually tearing up when Jessica mentioned hearing the heartbeat for the first time, and I'd sat there with Maya beside me, feeling like we were watching this scene through glass, present, but not really part of it. My mother had made a few passive comments in my direction, saying things like, "It's so nice you finally made time to visit. We were starting to think you'd forgotten about us," with that edge of martyrdom she'd perfected. And Jessica had asked me condescending questions about my life in Seattle, whether I was still doing nursing, and had I met anyone, her tone suggesting she already knew the answers wouldn't be interesting. The conversation had circled back to baby shower planning, my mother pulling out her phone to show Pinterest boards she'd created and discussing venues and guest lists and themes, talking about how this baby was going to be so celebrated and so loved. And I'd felt Maya tugging on my sleeve and whispering, "Mommy, why isn't Grandma talking to us?" loud enough that everyone had heard. And the table had gone briefly quiet before my mother had forced a smile and said, "We're just excited about the new baby, sweetheart," without even asking Maya her name. The moment came during a lull in the baby shower conversation when my mother had been showing Jessica yet another onesie design on her phone and talking about how this baby was going to have everything. Every advantage, every opportunity to be perfect. And then she'd look down the table at me with that expression I'd seen 1,000 times before, that mixture of pity and disappointment. And she'd said, "Your sister's baby will be perfect, just perfect. When's your turn, Sarah? Don't you think it's time you settled down and gave us grandchildren?" The words had hung in the air like a physical thing, and I'd felt Maya's hand reach for mine under the table, her small fingers curling into my palm. And I'd looked at my mother and felt this absolute clarity wash over me, this moment where I knew exactly what I was about to do and exactly why I needed to do it. The table had gone quiet, waiting for my response. Jessica paused mid-scroll on her phone, Mark looking uncomfortable, my father's fork halfway to his mouth, and I'd taken a breath and said in the calmest voice I could manage, "It already happened. 4 years ago." For a moment, no one had moved, like they were all waiting for the punchline. And then my mother had laughed this nervous little laugh and said, "What are you talking about?" And I'd squeezed Maya's hand and said clearly, making sure everyone heard, "Mom, Dad, Jessica, this is Maya, your granddaughter, my daughter. She turned 4 last March." The silence that followed was absolute. the kind of silence where you can hear the house settling and someone's breath catching. And I'd watched my mother's face go through a series of expressions, confusion giving way to what looked like genuine shock, and she'd said, "That's not funny, Sarah," as if I'd told a joke in poor taste. Jessica had put down her phone and was staring at Maya with wide eyes, really looking at her for the first time, and I could see her doing the math, counting backwards, remembering. And my father had cleared his throat and said, "Sarah, what exactly are you saying?" In that careful tone he used when he was trying to control a situation. I'd pulled out my phone with my free hand, the one not holding Maya's, and I'd opened my photo album to the folder I'd prepared. 4 years of pictures organized chronologically, and I'd started passing my phone around the table and said, "I'm saying that I called Mom 5 years ago to tell her I was pregnant. I'm saying that I sent you a birth announcement when Maya was born. I'm saying that this is your grandchild who you've never met because you couldn't be bothered to care." My mother had grabbed my phone and was scrolling through the pictures with trembling hands, her face going pale, and she'd looked up at me and said, "I don't understand. You never told us. We would have known. We would have remembered." And I'd felt something break open in my chest, this dam of hurt finally cracking. I'd taken my phone back from my mother's shaking hands, and I'd opened my text messages, scrolling back through years of conversations until I found the thread with her from 5 years ago, and I'd cleared my throat and said, "May 15th, 2019. I called you from Seattle at 7 in the evening your time. I told you I was 12 weeks pregnant. You asked if I was married. I said not yet, but David and I were planning to. You said, 'What will people think?' And then you told me you had to go because you were helping Jessica pick bridesmaid dresses." I'd watched my mother's face change as I spoke, recognition dawning, and she'd opened her mouth to say something, but I'd continued, holding up my phone so everyone could see the screen. "Here's the text you sent me 3 days after Maya was born, March 22nd, 2020. It says, 'Congratulations,' and then immediately, 'Have you ordered your dress for Jessica's wedding yet? The seamstress needs measurements. No questions about the baby's health. No asking about her name. Nothing." My father had leaned forward to look at the phone, and I'd seen something crumble in his expression, and he'd said weakly, "We thought you'd bring her to visit. We didn't realize you were serious about keeping distance." And I'd actually laughed at that, a sharp sound that made Maya press closer to my side. "I sent you a birth announcement in the mail, a physical card with Maya's photo and her birth details. I have the receipt from the post office. It was delivered on March 25th, 2020. I'd pulled up another photo on my phone, a picture of the announcement I'd kept a copy of. Maya's newborn face peaceful against a white blanket, and I'd passed the phone to Jessica this time, watching her stare at it with something like horror growing on her face. My mother had shifted tactics then, her voice taking on that defensive edge as she'd said, "You should have tried harder to reach out, Sarah. You knew we were busy with the wedding. You could have called more. You chose to shut us out." I'd felt Maya's confusion in the way she'd looked up at me, and I'd kept my voice steady as I'd said, "I called 6 times in Maya's first year. I sent Christmas photos. I invited you to her first birthday party. You responded to none of it. Dad, you sent a card with $50 for her second birthday with no note. Mom, you didn't acknowledge her third birthday at all." My father had no response to that. He'd just stared at his plate with his shoulders hunched, and Jessica had been uncharacteristically quiet, her eyes moving between me and our parents, and I could see her putting pieces together, remembering those years, probably recalling how consumed everyone had been with her wedding planning and then her career and her life. Mark had set down his fork carefully, and I'd seen him watching my mother with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between disappointment and shock. And my mother had said, "This isn't fair. You're making us look like monsters." And I'd responded quietly, "I'm just telling you what happened. These are facts, dates, messages, things you did and didn't do." My mother's face had flushed red, and she'd stood up from the table abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and she'd pointed at me with a shaking finger and said, "You're being dramatic, Sarah. You always do this. You twist things to make yourself the victim. I'd stayed seated, keeping Maya close, and I'd said in that same calm voice, "Let's talk about dramatic then. When I graduated nursing school with honors, you didn't come to the ceremony because Jessica had a gallery showing for her student art that same weekend. When I got my first job at Seattle General, you asked if I'd considered something with better hours so I could visit home more. When I bought my house, you told me I should have consulted you first because the neighborhood might not be good for resale value. When I married David at the courthouse, you said it was a shame I didn't want a real wedding, even though I'd invited you and you said you couldn't make the trip." I'd watched my father shift uncomfortably and he'd tried to interrupt with, "We were busy with Jessica's wedding planning. You know how stressful that time was." And I'd turned to look at him directly and said, "For 4 years, Dad? You were busy for Maya's entire life?" The silence that followed had been heavy, and then Jessica had spoken up, her voice defensive, saying, "They didn't mean to ignore you, Sarah. They just had a lot going on, and you moved so far away, you made it hard." I'd looked at my sister then, really looked at her, and I'd felt decades of hurt crystallize into words, and I'd said, "Jessica, do you remember when I won the state science fair in 10th grade? Mom took you shopping that day for homecoming dresses, even though your dance wasn't for 2 months. Do you remember when I got accepted to Johns Hopkins nursing program with a full scholarship? Dad took you to tour art schools that weekend. Do you remember when I told you I was pregnant and you said that's nice, and then spent 30 minutes telling me about your wedding cake tasting?" I'd watched my sister's face change as I spoke, watched her eyes fill with tears, and she'd said quietly, "I knew. I always knew they treated you differently. I just didn't think it mattered that much." Maya had been looking up at me with worried eyes, and I'd smoothed her hair back and kissed her forehead, keeping her close as I'd said to all of them, "I built a life without you because you made it clear I wasn't a priority. I built a career, a marriage, a family. I have friends who threw me a baby shower and held my hand during labor. I have coworkers who babysit Maya and celebrate her birthday. I have a community that chose to love us. I didn't shut you out. You were never in." Mark had been quiet through most of the confrontation, sitting beside Jessica with that unreadable expression on his face. But now he set his napkin down deliberately and cleared his throat and said, "I need to say something." My mother had turned to him with surprise, and my father had looked almost grateful for the interruption, probably hoping Mark would defend them or diffuse the tension, but Mark had looked directly at me and said, "Sarah, I've only known this family for 2 years, since Jessica and I started dating, but I've seen exactly what you're talking about." Jessica had stiffened beside him, and my mother had said sharply, "Mark, this is a family matter." But he'd continued as if she hadn't spoken and said, "Every time we visit, every phone call, every holiday, it's been clear who the focus is. I've heard the way you talk about Jessica's work, her life, her choices, like everything she does is miraculous. And I've heard the way you talk about Sarah when she's not here, like she's difficult or distant or deliberately making things hard. But she lives 2,000 miles away, and you've never once visited her. Not once in the 2 years I've been part of this family." My mother's face had gone pale, and then flushed again, and she'd said, "You don't understand the full situation." And Mark had replied quietly, "I understand that there's a 4-year-old granddaughter you didn't know about, because you couldn't be bothered to pay attention to anything Sarah said or did." The words had hung in the air, and Jessica had started crying then, not the delicate tears she sometimes used for effect, but real sobs that shook her shoulders, and she'd turned to me with her face crumpling and said, "I'm jealous of you, Sarah. I've always been jealous of you." I'd stared at my sister in genuine shock, because that made no sense, none at all. And I'd said, "Jealous of what? You got everything. Every bit of attention, every celebration, every ounce of their pride." Jessica had shaken her head and wiped at her eyes and said, "You got to leave. You got to build your own life without them watching every move and weighing in on every decision and being disappointed when you didn't do things exactly how they wanted. You think it's been easy being the favorite? Every choice I make has to be perfect. My art career has to justify their bragging. My wedding had to be exactly what Mom envisioned. My house, my husband, my pregnancy timeline, all of it choreographed and approved. You got to be free. The revelation had shifted something in the room, and I'd felt my anger toward Jessica complicate into something more nuanced, and my father had finally spoken with real emotion in his voice, saying, "I failed you, Sarah. We failed you. We got so caught up in Jessica's life because she was here, she was available, and we convinced ourselves you didn't need us because you were so capable and independent. But that's not a reason. That's an excuse." My mother had been silent, and I'd seen her hands trembling where they gripped her wine glass. And I'd realized suddenly that this wasn't about winning this argument or proving I was right. This was about whether I wanted to maintain any relationship with these people at all, and if I did, what boundaries that relationship would need to have to protect Maya and myself from more hurt. I'd taken a breath and felt Maya's small hand grip mine under the table, and I'd looked at each of them in turn. My mother with her trembling hands, my father with his guilty eyes, Jessica still crying quietly beside Mark, and I'd said, "I need you all to understand something. When I moved to Seattle 7 years ago, I was running away from the feeling of being invisible. I thought maybe distance would make you notice me, make you reach out, make you care. But what I found instead was something better. I built a life that I'm proud of. I'm the head nurse in the cardiac unit at Seattle General. I supervise a team of 12 nurses, and I've implemented protocols that have reduced patient complications by 18%. I've been published in 2 nursing journals. I teach classes to new nurses twice a month. My colleagues respect me. My supervisors value my input. Last year I was offered a position at Johns Hopkins, the program I graduated from, to help develop their cardiac care training, and I turned it down because I'd built a home in Seattle. I'd watched my mother's eyes widen slightly, and I'd continued. "I've been married to David for 4 years. He's my partner in every sense. He knows when I've had a hard day before I say a word. He's the father Maya deserves, patient and present and proud of her. We own our home, a 3-bedroom craftsman with a garden where Maya helps plant tomatoes every spring. We have friends who come over for dinners and game nights and who watch Maya when we need a date night. We have a community at Maya's preschool where I volunteer once a week. We have a life that's full and rich and good." I'd looked down at Maya and smoothed her hair again and said, "And we have this perfect little girl who's smart and kind and curious about everything. She's reading at a first-grade level already. She wants to be a doctor like the ones Mommy works with. She takes dance classes on Tuesdays and swimming lessons on Saturdays. She has 3 best friends at school, and she's invited to every birthday party. She's loved and celebrated and seen every single day." I'd lifted my eyes back to my parents and said clearly, "I don't need your validation anymore. I stopped needing it somewhere between Maya's first birthday party, which 30 people attended and none of you, and her first day of preschool, when David and I both took off work to drop her off together. I don't need you to be proud of me, because I'm proud of myself, and the people who matter most are proud of me. But here's the thing. Maya deserves to know her family if that family is willing to actually be present in her life. Not performatively present, not obligatory birthday cards and Christmas gifts present. Actually present. That means regular video calls. That means visits that go both ways. That means you learn what she likes and what she's afraid of and what makes her laugh. That means you show up consistently and prove that you want to be in her life." My mother had started crying then, real tears that streaked her makeup, and she'd said brokenly, "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry." And my father had reached across the table toward me with his hand extended and said, "Please, please let us try to make this right." And Jessica had stood up and come around the table and wrapped her arms around me from behind and whispered, "I'm with you. Whatever boundaries you need, I support them." The dinner had ended not with resolution, but with exhaustion. All of us emotionally wrung out and uncertain how to proceed. And my mother had stood up from the table with tears still wet on her cheeks and said, "Can I spend some time with Maya? Just a few minutes before you go? I'd felt every protective instinct rise up because Maya was my daughter, and these people had forfeited their right to her. But I'd also seen the way Maya had been watching everything with those perceptive brown eyes, and I'd known she deserved the chance to meet her grandmother if she wanted to. So I'd said, "Maya, would you like to go see Grandma's garden?" And my mother had looked so grateful and so broken that I'd almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I'd added firmly, 15 minutes. I'll be watching from the window. And my mother had nodded quickly and reached out her hand to Maya, who'd looked up at me for permission before taking it. And I'd watched them walk outside into the late afternoon sun, my mother pointing out the roses along the fence, and Maya asking questions in that endless, curious way 4-year-olds have. Through the window, I'd seen my mother crouch down to Maya's level and say something that made Maya smile. And I'd felt David's hand on my shoulder as he stood beside me and said quietly, "You okay?" And I'd answered honestly, "I don't know." My father had stood awkwardly in the dining room and said, "Sarah, I meant what I said. I want to make this right, whatever it takes." And I'd turned to him and said, "It's going to take time, years probably. You don't get to miss 4 years of her life and then show up and be grandpa of the year. You have to earn it. Both of you do." He'd nodded and said, "We will, I promise we will." And I'd thought about all the promises that had been broken over my lifetime, all the times I'd hoped they'd notice me and they hadn't, but I'd also seen something different in his eyes now, something that looked like genuine remorse. Jessica had touched my arm and said, "Can we talk? Just the two of us?" And I'd followed her into the kitchen where we'd helped with dishes 1,000 times as kids, where she'd always been praised for helping while I'd just been expected to, and she'd turned to me with her hand on her belly and said, I'm sorry for every time I let them make you feel less than. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you. I'm sorry I was so wrapped up in my own life that I didn't notice you were gone." I'd felt tears threatening again, and I'd said, "I needed you. Growing up, I needed you to be my sister, not my competition." And Jessica had started crying too and said, I know. I want to be that now. I want Maya to know her aunt. I want my baby to know their cousin. I want us to be sisters for real." We'd hugged then, awkwardly at first and then tighter, and I'd felt something shift between us that felt like the beginning of something authentic. When I'd gone back outside, Maya had been showing my mother a rock she'd found and explaining its properties with complete seriousness, and my mother had been listening like it was the most important information in the world, and I'd said, "Time to go, sweetheart." And my mother had said, "Will you come back, please?" And I'd answered carefully, "We'll see. Maybe a video call next week. If that goes well, we'll talk about visiting again." And I'd seen her recognize that I was setting terms, establishing boundaries, and surprisingly, she'd nodded and said, "Whatever you need, whatever you're comfortable with." 3 months had passed since that dinner, and the healing had been gradual and uncertain, and far more complicated than I'd imagined it could be, like watching a bone knit back together slowly after a bad break, never quite the same but functional if you were careful with it. The first video call had been awkward, my mother's face too close to the camera, and her voice too bright as she'd asked Maya about preschool, and I'd sat just off screen ready to end it if Maya seemed uncomfortable. But my daughter had warmed up and told Grandma about her dance recital and the butterfly she'd found in the garden, and my mother had listened with an attention that felt genuine, even if it was born from guilt. The second call had been easier, and the third easier still, until it became a routine every Sunday evening. Maya sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop while my mother asked about her week and actually remembered the details Maya shared. My father had joined the calls too, quieter than my mother but present, asking careful questions about Maya's favorite books and her swimming lessons, and I'd seen him write things down like he was studying for a test he desperately needed to pass. Jessica had called me separately twice a week, sometimes to talk about her pregnancy and the changes in her body and her fears about becoming a mother, but more often to ask about Maya and to share memories from our childhood that she was seeing differently now, apologizing for moments I'd half forgotten, and explaining dynamics I hadn't understood as a child. Maya's 5th birthday party had been the real test, and I'd hesitated for 2 weeks before extending the invitation, discussing it with David late at night in bed while he'd held my hand and reminded me that I could always change my mind, that protecting myself and Maya was still the priority. They'd come, all of them, my parents arriving with gifts they'd clearly put thought into, a collection of chapter books Maya had mentioned wanting, and a child's microscope because she'd told Grandma she wanted to study bugs, and my mother had cried when Maya had hugged her and said thank you. My father had sat on the floor during the party and helped Maya and her friends with a puzzle, not performing grandfatherhood, but actually engaging, and I'd watched from the kitchen doorway feeling something tight in my chest start to loosen just slightly. Jessica had come with Mark, and she'd been 7 months pregnant by then, moving carefully, and she'd pulled me aside to say, "I'm terrified I'll mess this up the way Mom and Dad messed us up," and I'd told her honestly, "The fact that you're worried about it means you probably won't." David had noticed the change in me that night after everyone had left, and Maya was asleep, and we were cleaning up wrapping paper and cake plates, and he'd said, "You seem lighter," and I'd realized he was right, that some burden I'd been carrying for so long had shifted even if it hadn't disappeared entirely, and I'd said, "It's not perfect, and I don't know if it ever will be, but maybe it can be something," and he'd kissed my forehead and said, "That's enough for now." 6 months after that confrontation at the dinner table that had changed everything, I stood in my parents' backyard watching them host Jessica's baby shower, and the difference in how they treated Maya now was so visible that extended family members who didn't know our history kept commenting on how wonderful it was that the cousins would grow up together. My mother had set up tables under the oak tree where I'd played as a child, the same tree where I'd once broken my arm falling from a branch, and she'd been annoyed about missing Jessica's recital to take me to the emergency room, and now she was introducing Maya to aunts and cousins with genuine pride in her voice, saying, "This is my granddaughter Maya. She's 5 and she's incredibly smart. She wants to be a scientist." And when one of my aunts had said in confusion, "I didn't know Sarah had a daughter," my mother had taken a breath and said clearly, "Yes, I should have told everyone sooner. I made mistakes, but we're making up for that now." I'd watched that moment from across the yard where I was helping Jessica open gifts, and I'd felt something complicated in my chest. Not quite forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of it. Because accountability mattered, and my mother was finally taking some. Jessica had opened the gift from David and me, a handmade quilt I'd spent 2 months working on in the evenings after Maya went to bed, each square a different pattern in soft blues and greens, and she'd cried and said, "Sarah, this is beautiful, this is too much," and I'd said, "It's what family does," and meant it. My father had sought me out mid-afternoon, finding me in the kitchen refilling the lemonade pitcher, and he'd said quietly, "I want you to know I've been going to therapy. Your mother and I both have. We're trying to understand how we failed you so we don't repeat it with Maya or with Jessica's baby." And I'd set down the pitcher and looked at him, really looked at him and seen the weight he was carrying and said, "Thank you for telling me that. That matters." He'd nodded and said, "I don't expect you to forget what we did, but I hope someday you can trust us again." And I'd answered honestly, "I'm working on it. Some days are easier than others." Later, my mother had found me sitting on the porch steps watching Maya play with the other children, and she'd sat down beside me and said, "I owe you a real apology. Not the frantic one I gave when you confronted us, but a real one." And I'd waited and she'd continued, "I spent your whole life comparing you to Jessica, and I told myself it was because Jessica needed more support. But the truth is, I was intimidated by you. You were always so capable and independent, and you didn't seem to need me, so I gave my attention to Jessica, who did, and that was wrong. It was cruel. I missed watching my granddaughter's first 4 years because I couldn't admit I'd been a terrible mother to you, and I will regret that for the rest of my life. And her voice had broken, and I'd felt tears in my own eyes, because this was what I'd needed, this acknowledgement without excuses. I'd said, I did need you. I needed you my whole childhood, and you weren't there, not really, and that hurt shaped who I became. And she'd said, I know, I see that now. I'm so sorry, Sarah. And I'd reached out and taken her hand and said, I'm not ready to say it's okay because it's not okay, but I can say I'm willing to keep trying if you are. And she'd squeezed my hand and nodded. The afternoon had stretched into evening, and I'd stood by David's side watching Maya run through the grass with her cousins, her laughter bright and clear in the summer air. And he'd put his arm around me and said, How are you feeling? And I'd leaned into him and said, Good, really good, and meant it. I'd spent so many years believing my worth was tied to whether my family noticed me, and then I'd spent years building a life to prove I didn't need their notice, but standing there watching my daughter be loved by people who were finally trying, I'd understood that my worth had never depended on either their dismissal or their acceptance. I'd found it in the quiet moments of my marriage, in the weight of Maya in my arms as a newborn, in the patients who trusted me with their care, in the friends who'd shown up when my blood family hadn't. This reconnection with my parents and Jessica wasn't healing that old wound entirely, but it was allowing something new to grow alongside the scar tissue, and that was enough. Maya had run up to me then, her face flushed and happy, and said, Mommy, Grandma says we can come back next weekend and help her plant flowers, can we? And I'd looked across the yard at my mother who was watching us hopefully, and I'd said, Yeah, sweetheart, I think we can do that, and watched my mother's face transform with relief and gratitude. The future stretched out ahead of us, uncertain and imperfect, built on boundaries I would maintain, and trust that would have to be earned again and again. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I might actually have the family I'd always wanted. Not because they'd finally decided I was worth their attention, but because I'd demanded it and refused to accept less than I deserved.